What if a single photograph could unravel a family's darkest secret? What if the answer was hiding in plain sight for nearly a century, waiting in the left hand of a woman who never wanted it found? Margaret Sullivan held the photograph carefully between her fingers, her reading glasses perched low on her nose as afternoon light streamed through the window of her Philadelphia apartment. The image was sepia-toned, faded at the edges, mounted on thick cardboard that had yellowed with age. November rain tapped against the window pane as she studied the portrait she had seen countless times before, yet never truly examined. The photograph showed her great-aunt Eleanor Hartwell, seated in an ornate chair with carved wooden armrests, wearing a dark dress with a high collar typical of 1928. 2 children flanked her, a girl of about 7 on her right, dressed in a pale cotton dress with ruffled sleeves, and a boy of perhaps 5 on her left, wearing short pants and a crisp white shirt. The backdrop was painted canvas, depicting a generic parlor scene with columns and draped fabric, the kind used in portrait studios across America during that era. Margaret had inherited the photograph 3 weeks earlier, along with a collection of family documents after her mother's passing. While sorting through the estate papers, she had found this portrait wrapped in tissue paper, tucked inside a leather-bound Bible that hadn't been opened in decades. A handwritten note, brittle with age, was attached to the frame's backing. Eleanor, Thomas, and Catherine, taken at Whitmore Studio, Baltimore, April 1928. Look closely. Those last 2 words had haunted Margaret ever since. Look closely at what? She had examined every visible detail, the children's expressions, solemn and unsmiling as was customary, the studio furniture, the painted backdrop. Even the photographer's embossed stamp on the corner of the mount. Nothing seemed unusual or out of place for a formal family portrait of that period. But tonight, as rain continued its steady rhythm and the apartment grew quiet around her, Margaret noticed something she had overlooked before. Eleanor's left hand rested on the armrest of the chair, positioned deliberately in the foreground of the composition. Her fingers were arranged in an unusual manner, not relaxed or naturally posed, but held with apparent intention. The thumb and index finger formed a small circle, while the remaining 3 fingers extended upward at precise angles. Margaret leaned closer, her heart beginning to beat faster. This wasn't a natural hand position. It looked uncomfortable, even strained. Why would someone hold their hand that way for a formal portrait? She reached for her magnifying glass, the one she used for examining antique documents in her work as an archivist at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Under magnification, the details became clearer. Eleanor's knuckles showed tension, the tendons visible beneath skin. The positioning was deliberate, almost forced, and there, barely visible in the shadows between her thumb and forefinger, was something else. A small object, dark against the darker fabric of her dress, clutched within that circular grip. Margaret's pulse quickened. She adjusted the magnifying glass, angling the photograph toward the lamp. The object was rectangular, thin, no larger than a postage stamp. It appeared to be paper, folded multiple times to create a tiny square. Eleanor's fingers concealed it almost completely, but not quite. Whoever had taken this photograph would have seen it, yet it remained in the final print, preserved for 97 years. The realization struck Margaret with unexpected force. This wasn't an accidental detail or a trick of shadow and light. Eleanor had hidden something in plain sight, positioned it precisely where it would be visible to anyone who looked closely enough, yet easily dismissed as nothing more than the play of light on fabric by casual observers. Margaret set down the magnifying glass and picked up her phone, her hands trembling slightly. She needed better equipment, professional analysis. Tomorrow she would take the photograph to the conservation lab at the Historical Society. They had digital scanning equipment capable of revealing details invisible to the naked eye, technology that could enhance contrast and expose hidden elements in historical photographs. But tonight, alone in her apartment with rain falling outside and the portrait lying on her desk under lamplight, Margaret felt the weight of something significant pressing against her awareness. This photograph had been preserved deliberately, wrapped carefully, hidden in a Bible with a note that urged examination. Someone in her family had known there was more to this image than met the eye. She looked at Eleanor's face, studying the woman's expression for the first time with real attention. Her great-aunt's eyes stared directly at the camera, unsmiling but not stern. There was something else in that gaze, something Margaret couldn't quite name. Determination, perhaps, or desperation. Eleanor looked like a woman carrying a burden, holding on to something precious, something she needed to preserve but couldn't speak aloud. Who were you, Margaret wondered, and what were you trying to tell us? The Historical Society of Pennsylvania occupied a stately building on Locust Street, its limestone facade weathered by more than a century of Philadelphia winters. Margaret arrived early Tuesday morning, the photograph secured in an acid-free archival folder, protected from moisture and light. The rain had stopped overnight, leaving the city washed clean, autumn leaves plastered against sidewalks in patterns that would disappear by afternoon. Sarah Chen, the Society's chief conservator, met Margaret in the digital imaging lab on the third floor. The room was temperature-controlled, filled with specialized equipment, high-resolution scanners, microscopes with digital cameras, computer monitors displaying magnified images of historical documents. Sarah had worked with Margaret on numerous projects over the past 5 years, analyzing everything from Civil War correspondence to colonial-era land deeds. Margaret explained what she had discovered the previous evening, pointing out Eleanor's unusual hand position and the small dark object barely visible between her fingers. Sarah listened without interruption, her expression growing more interested as Margaret described the note attached to the frame's backing. When Margaret finished, Sarah carefully removed the photograph from its protective folder and positioned it on the scanner's glass surface. The equipment hummed to life. Sarah adjusted settings on her computer, selecting parameters for maximum resolution and contrast enhancement. The scan would take several minutes, capturing every microscopic detail of the photograph's surface at a resolution far beyond what human eyes could perceive unaided. While the scanner worked, Sarah prepared a second station for close examination under her professional microscope, equipped with various lighting filters designed to reveal hidden elements in historical materials. Margaret watched the computer screen as the image began to appear, line by line in extraordinary detail. The scanner captured not just the photograph itself, but every crack in the paper, every speck of dust, every variation in the sepia toning. When the scan completed, Sarah opened it in specialized imaging software, the kind used by forensic document examiners and art conservators. She zoomed in on Eleanor's left hand, enlarging the image until individual grain particles of the photographic emulsion became visible. Margaret leaned forward, her breath catching. Under magnification, the object Eleanor held was clearly paper, folded into a tight square no more than half an inch across. But there was more. Along one visible edge, faint marks were discernible, too small and degraded to read at this magnification, but unmistakably present. Sarah made careful adjustments to the contrast and brightness, using filters designed to bring out faded text on historical documents. The marks became slightly clearer, revealing themselves as handwriting, tiny letters written in ink that had faded over decades but not disappeared completely. Margaret could make out what might be an uppercase letter, possibly an H or an R, followed by other characters too degraded to identify. "They need the original," Sarah said quietly, looking up from the screen. "If this paper is still inside the frame, if it was never removed, we might be able to recover it and read whatever is written on it. But we need to open the backing carefully, preserve any materials we find, stabilize them before attempting full restoration." Margaret nodded, though anxiety tightened in her chest. The photograph had been sealed for nearly a century. Whatever Eleanor had hidden might disintegrate upon exposure to air, crumble into dust before they could read it. But leaving it sealed meant never knowing what message her great-aunt had risked everything to preserve. Sarah moved the photograph to her microscope station, examining it under various lighting conditions. Direct light, raking light that emphasized texture, ultraviolet light that could reveal alterations or additions invisible under normal conditions. Under UV light, Eleanor's hand position became even more conspicuous. The skin showed different fluorescence patterns where tension had pulled the tissue taut, confirming that this positioning had been held uncomfortably, maintained deliberately for the duration of the exposure. Margaret pulled up the family history she had researched after finding the photograph. Eleanor Hartwell had been 32 years old in 1928, a widow raising 2 children alone after her husband Thomas Hartwell died in 1926 from complications of influenza. The children in the photograph, Thomas Jr. and Catherine, would have been 7 and 5 respectively, the ages that matched their appearance in the portrait. According to census records, Eleanor had worked as a seamstress, operating out of her home in Baltimore's Canton neighborhood. She had never remarried, dedicating herself entirely to raising her children through the difficult years of the late 1920s and early Depression. Thomas Jr. died in 1943 during the Allied invasion of Italy. Catherine, Margaret's grandmother, had lived until 2003, but had rarely spoken about her mother or her childhood in Baltimore. Sarah photographed the portrait from multiple angles, documenting its condition before any conservation work began. She noted the studio stamp, Whitmore Photography, 847 North Charles Street, Baltimore. A quick search revealed that the Whitmore studio had operated from 1922 until 1935, when it closed during the Depression. The photographer, Samuel Whitmore, had specialized in family portraits and formal compositions, establishing a reputation for quality work among Baltimore's middle-class families. The question that neither Margaret nor Sarah could answer was whether Whitmore had noticed what Eleanor was doing, whether he had recognized that his subject was hiding something in her hand, preserving it in the photograph intentionally. Had he been complicit in whatever Eleanor was attempting, or had she fooled him, concealing her secret so skillfully that even the photographer failed to see it? Margaret thought about the note again. Looked closely. Someone had known. Someone in her family had understood that this photograph contained more than it appeared to show, and had preserved it deliberately, passing it down through generations with instructions to examine it carefully. But who had written that note? Had it been Eleanor herself, or someone who discovered her secret years later? The process of opening the photograph's backing required patience and precision. Sarah worked methodically over the next hour, using specialized tools designed for conservation work: microspatulas, tweezers with rubber-coated tips, a small brush with soft bristles. Margaret watched from a respectful distance, knowing that any interference could cause irreparable damage. The photograph was mounted on heavy cardboard, typical of professional portrait studios in the 1920s. The backing consisted of additional cardboard, sealed with glued paper tape that had dried and brittled over decades. Sarah carefully lifted the edges, working millimeter by millimeter, pausing frequently to ensure no tears occurred in the historic materials. As the backing separated, a small envelope fell onto the examination table. Both women froze. The envelope was yellowed, made of thin paper, sealed with wax that had cracked but not completely broken. On its face, written in careful handwriting that matched the note Margaret had found, were 3 words: "For my children." Sarah photographed the envelope from multiple angles before touching it. Margaret's hands trembled as she watched. This was Eleanor's handwriting. This envelope had been sealed and hidden by her great-aunt 97 years ago, placed behind the photograph where it would remain undiscovered unless someone specifically looked for it. With infinite care, Sarah lifted the envelope, supporting it on a piece of acid-free paper. The wax seal crumbled slightly at her touch, releasing a faint, musty scent into the air. She positioned the envelope under a lamp, examining it for any indication of contents. Something was inside, visible as a slight bulge, but thin and flat. "Should we open it?" Sarah asked, looking at Margaret. "This is your family history. The decision should be yours." Margaret nodded, unable to speak. Sarah selected a conservation knife, its blade thin enough to slide beneath wax without cutting the paper. She worked with practiced skill, lifting the seal in fragments, preserving each piece for documentation. When the envelope finally opened, Sarah used tweezers to extract the contents. A single sheet of paper emerged, folded 3 times to create a small square. The paper was onion skin, extremely thin, the kind used for carbon copies or airmail correspondence when paperweight mattered. Sarah unfolded it with excruciating slowness, supporting each crease to prevent tearing. When fully opened, the sheet measured approximately 4 inches by 6 inches, covered on both sides with cramped handwriting in faded blue ink. Margaret leaned forward, her heart pounding. Sarah positioned the letter under magnification, adjusting lighting to make the faded ink more visible. The handwriting was meticulous, tiny letters crowded together to fit maximum information on minimal space. At the top, a date, April 15th, 1928. Sarah photographed the letter front and back before attempting to read it aloud. Her voice was steady but quiet in the controlled atmosphere of the conservation lab. The letter began without preamble, written by someone who knew time was limited and every word mattered. To my beloved children, Thomas and Catherine, if you are reading this, I am gone. The truth I could not speak aloud has been written here, preserved in the only way I knew to keep it safe. What I tell you now may change how you remember me, but I pray it will help you understand why I made the choices I made. Sarah paused, glancing at Margaret. Margaret nodded for her to continue. Your father did not die of influenza. Thomas Hartwell was murdered on the night of November 12, 1926, in our home while you slept in your bedroom upstairs. I witnessed it. I saw the man who killed him, but I could not go to the police. I could not tell anyone what I knew because the man who murdered your father was Detective James Brennan of the Baltimore Police Department. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah stopped reading, looking up at Margaret with wide eyes. Margaret felt her legs weaken, and she reached for a nearby stool, sitting down heavily. Her great-grandfather had been murdered. Her great-grandmother had witnessed it, and a police detective had been responsible. Sarah continued reading, her voice barely above a whisper. Your father had discovered something dangerous, evidence of corruption that reached high into the police department and the city government. He was an accountant for Brennan's brother-in-law, Wallace Martin, who ran a construction company that held multiple city contracts. Your father found discrepancies in the books, money being siphoned from public projects, bribes being paid to secure contracts. He told me he had documented everything, that he was going to report it to federal authorities. Margaret listened, pieces of family history clicking into place. She had always wondered why her grandmother Catherine never spoke about her father, why all family stories from that period remained vague and incomplete. Now she understood. Catherine had never known the truth. She had grown up believing her father died of illness, never knowing he had been killed to protect a criminal conspiracy. Brennan came to our house that night. I heard raised voices from downstairs. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, your father was already dying, stabbed in the chest. Brennan saw me. He told me that if I ever spoke of what I witnessed, he would make sure you children disappeared, that I would never see you again. He said he had connections everywhere that no one would believe me, a poor widow against a decorated police detective. Sarah turned the paper over, reading the text on the reverse side. I made a terrible choice. I stayed silent. I told the doctor who examined your father's body that he had fallen down the stairs, that his death was an accident. The doctor knew I was lying, I could see it in his eyes, but he recorded what I told him. And your father was buried with the official cause of death listed as accidental trauma. I have lived with this cowardice every day since, knowing I let your father's murderer walk free, knowing I sacrificed justice to keep you safe. Margaret wiped tears from her cheeks. Sarah paused, giving her time to compose herself before reading the final paragraph. The evidence your father collected still exists. I hid it where Brennan would never think to look, where it has remained safe these past 18 months. This photograph will guide you to it. Look at my left hand. Count the fingers I hold extended. 3. Remember the studio address. 847 North Charles Street. Your father's documents are hidden in our home. Beneath the floorboards in the sewing room, 3 boards from the north wall. Use this information wisely. Seek justice if you can, but never at the cost of your own safety. I love you both more than words can express. Your mother, Eleanor. Silence filled the conservation lab for several minutes after Sarah finished reading. Margaret sat motionless, staring at the letter spread out on the examination table. Her great-grandmother had lived with this knowledge, carrying the burden of witnessed murder and enforced silence, protecting her children while knowing their father's killer walked free. Sarah carefully placed the letter in a clear archival sleeve, protecting it from further deterioration. The paper was fragile. The ink faded, but Eleanor's words remained legible, her careful handwriting preserving truth across nearly a century. Margaret thought about the photograph again, understanding now why Eleanor had positioned her hand so deliberately, creating a visual clue that would mean nothing to anyone who didn't know what to look for. 3 fingers extended, 3 boards from the north wall. The evidence Thomas Hartwell had collected documenting police corruption was hidden beneath the floorboards of their home in Baltimore's Canton neighborhood. But that had been in 1928. What were the chances that the house still existed, that the hiding place remained undisturbed after 97 years of subsequent occupants and potential renovations? Sarah voiced the question Margaret was thinking. Do you know if the house is still standing? Do you have the address? Margaret pulled out her phone, accessing the family documents she had photographed and stored digitally. Among the estate papers she had inherited was a deed for property at 1847 South Conkling Street, Baltimore, purchased by Thomas and Eleanor Hartwell in 1923 and sold by Eleanor in 1935, presumably when she could no longer afford to maintain it during the Depression. She showed the address to Sarah, who immediately opened a browser on her computer and searched property records. The house appeared in current listings, a narrow brick row house typical of Baltimore's working-class neighborhoods in the early 20th century. According to the city's property database, the structure had been built in 1910 and remained largely unmodified, classified as a contributing building in a historic district that protected against major alterations. The current owner was listed as Daniel Kowalski, who had purchased the property in 2019. Sarah found a real estate listing from the sale with photographs showing the interior. The house had been renovated somewhat, with modern fixtures in the kitchen and bathroom, but many original features remained: hardwood floors, built-in cabinets, decorative molding. One photograph showed what was labeled as a second-floor study, a small room with a sewing machine positioned near the window. Margaret's breath caught. The sewing room, the place where Eleanor had worked, where she had hidden her husband's evidence. The room appeared largely unchanged, the floorboards original, made of narrow oak planks common to that period. If Eleanor's hiding place had never been discovered, if subsequent residents had never lifted those specific boards, Thomas Hartwell's documents might still be there. But approaching the current owner presented complications. Margaret couldn't simply knock on the door and ask to tear up the floorboards based on a 97-year-old letter from a murder victim's widow. She needed a strategy, a way to gain access to that room without revealing the full story or creating legal complications. Sarah suggested contacting the Baltimore Police Department's cold case unit. Eleanor's letter constituted evidence of a murder, even one that occurred almost a century ago. If the department took the allegation seriously, they could potentially obtain a warrant to search the property. But that approach carried risks. What if Detective James Brennan had descendants still connected to the police department? What if the corruption Eleanor described had been buried so deeply that exposing it now would threaten powerful interests? Margaret thought about her great-grandmother, about the impossible choice Eleanor had faced: speak truth and risk her children's lives, or remain silent and let a murderer escape justice. Eleanor had chosen her children's safety, but she had also preserved the truth, hidden it where time might eventually bring it to light. Margaret felt the weight of that responsibility now, the obligation to finish what Eleanor had started. She made a decision. She would go to Baltimore, find the house, and approach Daniel Kowalski directly. She would explain that she was researching family history, that her great-grandmother had lived in that house in the 1920s, and ask permission to examine the sewing room. It was a thin pretext, but it might work. Many people were sympathetic to genealogical research, interested in the history of their homes. Sarah packaged the letter and photograph in archival materials, ensuring both would be preserved safely. She provided Margaret with high-resolution digital scans of everything, images sharp enough to reveal every detail. Margaret thanked her and left the Historical Society, stepping out into Philadelphia's afternoon sun with evidence of murder hidden in her bag. The drive to Baltimore took just under 2 hours. Margaret spent the time researching Detective James Brennan, searching historical newspaper archives for any mention of his name. She found surprisingly little. A few brief references in crime reports from the 1920s, notation that he had received a commendation in 1927 for solving a robbery case, and a death notice from 1952. Brennan had lived to be 73 years old, dying peacefully in his sleep, never answering for the murder of Thomas Hartwell. She also found Wallace Martin, the construction company owner whose corrupt practices Thomas Hartwell had discovered. Martin's business had thrived through the 1930s, securing numerous public contracts even as the Depression devastated Baltimore's economy. He had died in 1948, wealthy and respected, his obituary describing him as a pillar of the community and generous philanthropist. The corruption Thomas had documented appeared to have continued undisturbed, enriching Martin and his associates while public infrastructure crumbled and city funds disappeared. Margaret arrived in Canton as afternoon faded toward evening. The neighborhood had gentrified substantially since Eleanor's time. Old row houses renovated and repurposed, industrial buildings converted to apartments and shops. But the essential character remained recognizable. Narrow streets lined with brick facades, marble stoops leading to front doors, the proximity to Baltimore's harbor visible in gaps between buildings. She found 1847 South Conkling Street easily, a three-story row house painted deep red, its brick facade well maintained. Lights were on inside, suggesting someone was home. Margaret sat in her car for several minutes, gathering courage, rehearsing what she would say. Finally, as darkness began settling over the city, she approached the front door and knocked. Daniel Kowalski answered the door with a cautious smile, the kind that reveals both curiosity and reserve. Margaret introduced herself, mentioning her connection to the house through her great-grandmother, Eleanor Hartwell, who had lived there almost a century ago. She explained she was researching her family history and asked if he would be willing to let her see the old sewing room. Daniel hesitated, but recognized the sincerity in Margaret's voice. "I've always loved hearing about the stories these old houses hold," he said, gesturing for her to come inside. The interior was warm and inviting, a blend of renovation and preservation. Down a narrow hallway, Daniel led her upstairs to the small room at the back, where sunlight poured through lace curtains onto the original oak floorboards. Margaret scanned the room, heart pounding. Everything looked as Eleanor might have left it, aside from Daniel's modern furnishings. She counted the floorboards from the north wall, recalling the instructions in Eleanor's letter. 3 boards from the wall, beneath the place where her sewing table would have sat. "Is it okay if I lift one of these boards?" she asked, nervous. Daniel agreed without reservation, intrigued by the idea. Margaret used a flat tool Sarah had given her for just this purpose, and gently pried up the 3rd board. Dust and time had gathered beneath, but something remained, a small metal box, tarnished but intact, wedged deep within the cavity. With trembling hands, Margaret pulled it free. The box was surprisingly heavy for its size. Daniel watched in stunned silence as she opened it to reveal a collection of aged documents, bank ledgers, ledger sheets, letters written in her great-grandfather's elegant script, and signed receipts for repairs never completed. Each sheet was a piece of Thomas Hartwell's original evidence, detailing the corruption Eleanor had alluded to in her letter. Margaret stared down in awe, her mind whirring with the implications. Eleanor's careful planning, her silent instruction through the portrait, had worked. After nearly a century, the truth was finally within reach. Margaret and Daniel sat together on the old wooden floor, examining the stack of documents. Each page was a testament to the risks her great-grandfather had taken and the desperation her great-grandmother had endured. The ledgers featured payments flowing to shell companies, documentation of funds missing from city projects, and lists of names with addresses, some Margaret recognized from her earlier research. As she translated the complex records into a digital spreadsheet on her laptop, Margaret realized how thorough Thomas had been. He'd even included coded letters and receipts signed by men who later held prominent city positions. Details matched the addresses for projects Eleanor had mentioned in her letter. New sidewalks that had supposedly been installed, roads that records claimed had been renovated, but that old family stories said were left crumbling. Daniel, moved by the gravity of what Margaret had recovered, offered to help. His background in local real estate allowed him to cross-reference addresses, confirming that many of the projects existed, though the historical work was indeed shoddy or incomplete according to city archives. Margaret's mind raced as she pieced together the bigger picture. This was the proof her ancestors had risked everything to preserve. She took photos of everything, documenting each page as evidence should the need arise. What overwhelmed her most was a letter Thomas had intended for authorities, never mailed. Its words, filled with courage and resignation, seemed to echo through the generations. If you find these records, tell our children why doing right was worth the risk, even when the cost was unthinkable. By morning, Margaret had made a decision. She could not let the story end in silence, buried once again. She compiled her research, photographs, and transcripts into a detailed report. Before returning to Philadelphia, Margaret made an appointment with a contact, a Baltimore journalist known for investigating historical cold cases and government corruption. She arrived at the small newsroom just after sunrise. Her contact, an energetic woman named Lila, listened intently as Margaret laid out the story. Beginning with the hidden message in the photograph, the discovery of Eleanor's letter, and the evidence found beneath the sewing room floor. Lila's eyes filled with disbelief, awe, and a fierce resolve. "This has the potential to change how we understand city history," Lila said, promising to handle the story with care and investigate the living legacy of the cover-up. Within days, the story ran on the local news, sparking widespread interest in Baltimore and beyond. Historians, city officials, and even descendants of those named in the records began to ask questions. The police reopened the case, issuing a statement acknowledging the fresh evidence and the remarkable tenacity of those who preserved it. As winter settled over Philadelphia, Margaret found herself reflecting on everything that had unfolded: Eleanor's courage and grief, the invisible burden her family bore, and the secret hidden in a simple gesture, a hand positioned to point the way for those determined to look closer. The house on South Conkling Street became a quiet landmark, a symbol of truth long buried but never fully erased. Lila's investigation spurred a wave of interest in forgotten histories, and Margaret found herself answering letters from family members and complete strangers moved by the story. But most of all, Margaret felt a sense of closure. Her great-grandmother's instructions, passed down in a photograph, had finally borne fruit. Justice, however delayed, was not impossible. The photograph remained on Margaret's desk, a silent reminder of persistence, love, and the power of memory. Those who dared to study the details, to look more closely, could unlock justice, even after almost a century of silence. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.